dark island of Neverland, the horrors of Peter Pan. In the dark, distant world known as Neverland, there are shadows that never touch the sun, and deep forests where every sound seems different from what it truly is. These places are not as joyful as the stories tell, and Peter Pan's laughter, once heard in every corner of the island, has long become a muffled echo that no longer entertains travelers. After many years of adventures with his friends, Peter Pan had changed. He became increasingly withdrawn, unwilling to play with the children. His once jubilant calls that filled the island had gradually become rare and subdued. His friends began to notice how he often stayed alone in dark corners, quietly whispering that he had seen them, the dark creatures. They laughed, trying to dismiss it, but soon doubts began to creep in. With each passing year, the island became more mysterious. Some inexplicable force awoke deep in the forests, releasing loud, unbearable sounds in the dark of night. The island was covered with ancient ruins that reflected a world long gone. Peter ordered the children not to approach this place, but one day, John and Michael couldn't resist their curiosity. There, amid the ruined walls, they found an ancient library. It was cluttered with dust and darkness. But one book, which didn't look as old as the others, caught their attention. It was an ancient manuscript written in a language they couldn't recognize. Upon opening it, John and Michael fell into a trap carefully set by Peter Pan himself. The moment they opened the book, a storm began. The air grew heavy and the sky darkened. The shadows that had been hiding in the forests emerged from their shelters. They were not visible, but the feeling of their presence grew stronger. Peter Pan appeared before them, but he was different. His face was serious, and there was a hollowness in his eyes that could never have been seen in his former joyful demeanor. He explained that the island had always been alive, but now something else had awakened. And now the island would not let them go. Soon the children began to notice that each day felt the same as the last, and even the sky seemed clouded, like in a nightmare. Peter, once the hero and protector, began to transform into the dark embodiment of fear that was increasingly taking over Neverland. Soon they realized that Peter himself had become part of these dark forces. He was their leader. The island had become their prison, and anyone who entered would stay forever. But even amidst this darkness, surrounded by their fears, the children decided to find a way back home. The night after the discovery of the manuscript became a nightmare. The darkness on the island was not ordinary. It not only swallowed the light, but seemed alive, as if it were breathing. Every breath of the night was bitter and cold, and an overwhelming tension hung in the air around the children. Peter Pan remained silent, as though enchanted by this power. His speech was no longer the same, and it seemed he didn't even understand what was happening to him. Children began to realize that every step they took might lead them deeper into the darkness. They tried to escape the island, but the sounds of invisible creatures and the heavy, cold silence were so deafening that they couldn't tell where reality began and ended. John and Michael, with no other choice, decided to explore the ruins of the old library, hoping to find some answers. The book they had found was written in a cipher, and even when they tried to decode it, the words became more and more tangled. Each line of the manuscript led to a new chapter in Peter Pan's story, but not the one they knew. Turned out that Peter was not simply a boy who didn't want to grow up. He was part of an endless battle for souls, and the island was his prison. But not all the creatures on the island were under his control. During one of their nightly walks, they stumbled upon a deep well in the forest, abandoned for centuries. The place breathed with ancient magic. By the well stood a statue of a strange woman, whose eyes seemed to emit light, but her gaze was filled with sorrow. It was a warning that John and Michael ignored. Soon after they left the well, new strange creatures began to appear. They resembled shadows, but moved faster than any human. Their movements were silent, and their faces had no features, only dark patches where their eyes and mouths should have been. They were the ghosts of the island, forgotten souls that had lost themselves and now had only one goal: to capture the new arrivals. That night, the forest came alive. From the depths of its dark corners came ominous whispers that seeped into their minds. Children could feel something strange pulling them into the darkness, as the line between the real and the unreal grew blurry. Each step forward brought them closer to something they couldn't understand. They began to notice that time on the island had become a loop. Each day repeated itself over and over, offering no chance for escape. One day, they decided to return to the very place where Peter had last left them, hoping it would somehow change their situation. Peter met them, but not as before. He was entirely different. His face was not alive, but seemed to have submerged into the darkness. In his eyes reflected all the fears and horrors of the island, and he no longer had the strength to fight them. "You don't understand," Peter said, his voice quiet and muffled. "This is not the island I showed you. It's a trap. The island is a part of me, a part of what I've become. You can't escape because I can't escape." Now the children understood. Peter was not just a boy. He had become the embodiment of the dark force that had bound the island to the world they once knew, and now he was trapped in this endless loop. But even in the darkness, there is room for resistance. John and Michael decided that if they couldn't move forward, they would try to move sideways, through the shadows. They found a hidden passage that seemed to lead deeper into the island. With each step, they approached the center of this nightmare, feeling their freedom tightening. Ahead lay only dark, incomprehensible labyrinths, where the whispers of evil spirits and the echoes of the past pierced the air. But within this abyss, they found it, an ancient mechanism that allowed the reality of the island to change. It was old, covered in moss, but when they touched its lever, something began to shift. The shadows began to dissolve, and Peter disappeared. But his laughter echoed in the air, like a ghost that remained where he once was. Now the island is once again immersed in silence, but John and Michael know they have only escaped temporarily. And no matter what happens, they will never return to the island as it was before. They have become part of its dark legends, and it was no longer just a story about a boy who didn't want to grow up. After John and Michael had temporarily stopped the chaos that engulfed the island, they thought they had saved themselves and perhaps even the entire island. But the feeling that something was still left behind unsettled them. What they had seen was only part of a much worse plan, and they realized this when they woke up one morning. Instead of returning home, they found themselves at the very place where Peter had first met them. The same sky was overhead. Everything seemed as it was before, but the sense of unreality grew stronger with each passing moment. The shadows of the island's power were everywhere. And with each day, more and more people who set foot on the island fell into the trap of its endless cyclical nature. It became their horrifying realization. They had become part of an eternal loop, one that started anew each time, leaving them no chance to escape. Children began to understand that there was an invisible key to everything, a force that limited their options. Finding it would mean a chance to break free from the cycle. But to do so, they needed to uncover what Peter had hidden from them, the true nature of the island. The key to this mystery was located in the darkest place on the island, the caves of which even Peter had only heard of in legends. It was known that this place was closed off to everyone, even to him. However, when John and Michael began searching for ancient maps in the library, they discovered strange markings on the maps that led to the dungeons, where they saw not just dark corridors but illusions of reality fracturing into pieces. Here, they encountered the most terrifying truth. Peter Pan was not only a part of the island, he was the key to its existence. The island had been created for him and for his terrible power, which knew no bounds. Peter had been cursed to live forever, and what he and his islanders had endured had no end. In reality, the island needed no one but Peter himself. His life was a trap for all who stepped onto its soil, and every death became part of the endless cycle that repeated itself whenever someone tried to escape. As John and Michael wandered through the dark corridors of the caves, they encountered another creature. It was a mother, but not an ordinary one. She was more than just human. In her eyes burned a light that seemed to try to lead them out of this endless cycle. But as soon as they tried to approach her, the mother transformed into a fading ghost, once again becoming just a part of the dark fabric of the island. "Are you searching for an escape? Do you think it's possible?" she asked them with a trembling voice. "The island wants you again, just as it wants everyone." And so, on the brink of despair, they encountered another old friend, Peter's shadow. This creature was like a reflection of Peter himself, but with a different essence, dark, frightening, and cold. Didn't speak, but its presence was like the air squeezing their lungs. It was the darkest part of his soul, hidden from everyone. In the darkness that consumed them, the children were forced to make a choice: stay and become part of this world, or try to resist it to the end, even if it meant losing their souls. Peter seemed to awaken from his slumber. His face became alive again, but not as they remembered it. He was charming again, but now he was dark and eerie. He asked them if they wanted to return in their original form or leave everything behind. "The choice is yours," he said with a smile that promised nothing good. The children made their choice. They tried to escape, but each time they found themselves in their own trap. To truly break free, they needed to not only shatter the magical cycle, but also strip Peter of his power. But that meant passing through all the shadows of his soul and facing all his fears. In their final choice, when they were on the verge of despair, John and Michael made a brutal decision. They chose to make a sacrifice. They gave up part of themselves, their consciousness, and in doing so, they forced the island to explode, depleting its very foundation. The island began to collapse, but the price was high. They had now become part of the darkness that remained after Peter. Peter, looking at them from a distant shore, smiled. They had finally escaped the trap. But whether they had truly escaped or had simply entered a new world remained a mystery. And so the island's story was far from over.